The transatlantic slave trade, also known as the triangular trade, saw European goods, such as guns, clothes, and alcohol, traded for African peoples who were cast as property to be bartered. Typically already enslaved by local merchants and rulers, these African men, women, and children were often prisoners of war or had been kidnapped for this purpose.
Shalom, like to give all honor and glory and praises to Yahweh, by Hashem, Yahushai, by Hashem Rakakadash, like your double honors to our apostles and elders, great millstone. Salutations to our sincere Akim, pushing this word out across the four corners of the world. In the title of this lesson, my delicate ones have gone rough ways, and that's referring to the book of Baruch 4:26. And it says, my delicate ones have gone rough ways and were taken away as a flock caught of the enemies. So who are the Most High's delicate ones? And let's answer that in the book of Psalm 148 verse 14. He also exalted the horn of his people, the praise of all his saints, even of the children of Israel, a people near unto him. Praise ye the Heavenly Father Yahweh. So the children of Israel, the biblical Israelites, and the way you would say it in the Lashon Kodash, which is the holy tongue, ancient Hebrew, is Yasha Allah. So we became a people near unto the Heavenly Father Yahweh because he only gave us his laws, statutes, and commandments. And that special holy covenant was the way that we were separated from all these other nations. That's why it stated in the book of Amos, the 3rd chapter, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. So those delicate ones of the Heavenly Father Yahweh are only referring to the biblical Israelites. And you go into the word delicate, it goes into refined, it goes into detail, and it also goes into sensitive. Pursuant to the book of Deuteronomy, the 7th chapter and the 6th verse, the Lord had chosen thee to be a special people unto himself above all nations upon the face of the earth. So going back to the book of Baruch 4:26, my delicate ones have gone rough ways and were taken away as a flock caught of the enemies. So what were those rough ways? Hence the transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage. And let's get that in the book of Isaiah, the 22nd chapter, starting verse 17. Behold, the Heavenly Father Yahweh will carry thee away with a mighty captivity. So that powerful captivity was the so-called white men, who are the biblical Edomites, teamed up with the so-called Africans, who are the biblical Hamites, and also the so-called Arabs, who are the biblical Ishmaelites. They took us away as captives from the western shores of Africa, and we suffered on those slave ships. So that mighty captivity goes into that transatlantic slave trade and how we were scattered amongst the four corners of the world. And that main captivity that the transatlantic slave trade took us to was America, known as Babylon the Great, according to the Holy Scriptures. So behold, the Heavenly Father Yahweh will carry thee away with a mighty captivity and will surely cover thee. So America is that mighty captivity, because this is the only place we as the Israelites truly lost our true customs, our true heritage, being Israelites. And that's why it's stated in the book of Jeremiah 17:4, how we will discontinue from our heritage, meaning losing our customs, our heritage, our commonwealth as Israelites. Verse 18, he will surely violently turn and toss thee like a ball into a large country. And that's the transatlantic slave trade, because we were mainly taken away from the western parts of Africa into all across the four corners of the world. So we was tossed like a ball, tossed to and fro. And notice it's stated right here, he will violently turn and toss thee like a ball. So that goes into those harsh conditions that we suffered on those slave ships, such as being cramped up amongst each other, having inadequate food, defecating on one another, suffering from physical and mental abuse, and the list goes on. So he will surely violently turn and toss thee like a ball into a large country. There shalt thou die, and there the chariots of thy glory should be the shame of thy Lord's house. And that goes into those curses, which was a sign and wonder to indicate who are the biblical Israelites, because no other nation never suffered this harsh punishment. So let's go right back into Baruch 4:26 again. My delicate ones, or my sensitive ones, have gone rough ways, and that's by the ways of the transatlantic slave trade, and were taken away as a flock caught of the enemies. So those opposing forces is referring to those other nations. You read to the book of Psalm, the 83rd chapter, it stated how they have taken crafty counsel against our people. And that's referring to all these other nations who are not Israelites. And let's get there in the book of Zechariah 2:8. For thus said the Lord of hosts, after the glory have he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you. So how were we spoiled as being the biblical Israelites? We were robbed from our true identity, our true customs as being the true biblical Israelites. We were robbed from knowing our power source, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushua. And that was done by the Heavenly Father Yahweh, and utilized this so-called white man to be the rod of his anger. And this so-called white man helped further the affliction of the Heavenly Father Yahweh. Like he went overboard with it. And who were his joint heirs? These other nations that we see in today's time. And that's why, again, you read into the book of Psalm, the 83rd chapter, it lists all these other nations who conspired together to cut us off from being a nation, to cut us off from being connected to our power source, Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahushua. And you read into the book of Ezekiel, the 36th chapter, it stated how the other nations were like, aha. And you go into the word aha in the blue letter, it goes into having the satisfaction of the misfortune of your enemy or rival. So they love seeing us being a broken people, or damaged or destroyed people. They love seeing us being discontinued from our heritage, because as long as we as the biblical Israelites are at the bottom, then that means that these other nations, they can stay in their rulership, in their glory, in their power. So it says, for thus said the Lord of hosts, after the glory have he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you, for he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of his eye. And let's get the word apple in the Hebrew.
Strong's H 892. Bava.
And to get to the point, it says the apple, pupil of the eye. So you go into the word pupil, it goes into like the center of your eye. So that means it's a sensitive area, because if you put somebody in their eye, it's sensitive, it's delicate. So by these other nations touching the apple of the Most High's eyes, referring to the biblical Israelites, you have touched a sensitive people to the Heavenly Father Yahweh. Because again, we were only given the law, statutes, commandments from the Heavenly Father Yahweh. So that made us as a centerpiece. So going back to this word pupil, which goes into center, so we as the Israelites are the centerpiece of the Heavenly Father Yahweh. Which takes me right back to Baruch 4:26. My delicate ones, or my sensitive ones, have gone rough ways and were taken away as a flock caught of the enemies. So these other nations, beginning with the tabernacle of Edom, they touch a made people. Pursuant to that movie, The Godfather, when Michael Corleone, which was played by Al Pacino, when he found out that his brother-in-law was working for the ops and he had his older brother Santino killed, he stated to his brother-in-law, you have to answer for Sonny, because he touched a made man. So how much more in the spirit these other nations touching the apple of the Most High's eyes, the ones that he holds in regard as sensitive, delicate, his precious ones, referring to his made people, the biblical Israelites. So Esau, Edom, along with these other nations who are his joint heirs, they have to answer what they did to us. So going back to Baruch 4:26, my delicate ones have gone rough ways and were taken away as a flock caught of the enemies. So with that, hopefully you all will edify, you all stay strong, keep pushing forward. Shalom.
Having by now been doubly enslaved, these dehumanized persons were transported in horrific conditions to the Americas, there to be sold by auction into lives of back-breaking work in households, on plantations, and other industries. The products of their labor, which included labor-intensive crops like sugar and cotton, were then traded with Europe, and in tragic irony, sometimes even with African kingdoms and merchants. In both their transportation and subsequent lives in the Americas, the enslaved were treated as property, deprived of their most basic rights, and often subjected to cruel and dehumanizing treatment. Spanning 5 centuries and 3 continents, this trade resulted in at least 12 million Africans being forcibly transported to the Americas, at least a third of them on British ships, many of which were specifically designed for this purpose. As many as 2 million died during the journey. Ships registered at Liverpool were responsible for transporting over 1.3 million enslaved Africans, those at London, 826,000, and Bristol, over 500,000.
John Newton, who would later become an Anglican minister, celebrated hymn writer, and a prominent abolitionist, was involved in the slave trade from 1745 and began working on slave ships in 1748. In his authentic narrative, he reflected on his work as first mate on the Brownlow. "My business in this voyage, while upon the coast, was to sail from place to place in the longboat to purchase slaves." In 1750, Newton became captain of a slave ship. His journal, letters to his wife, and biography record his 3 journeys as a captain aboard the Duke of Argyll and the African in great detail. Each journey began in England, with ships making their first stop on the west coast. Newton wrote to his wife in 1753 of his dealings with a local seller on the west coast of Africa. This man had several factories, as these trading posts were called, in different places, particularly one in Kitam.
It was in such a slave factory that Oluwada Equiano, a prominent African abolitionist, had been imprisoned after having been kidnapped in 1756 as a child from his home while his family worked in the fields. Equiano later remarked in his biography that kidnapping and taking prisoners of war were the 2 main measures by which Africans were enslaved. In regions increasingly destabilized by European colonial power, African merchants and rulers soon perceived there was considerable profit to be made by slave trading with Europeans. Sometimes this resulted in local conflicts being pursued in order to provide prisoners of war to feed European demands for cheap labor. As Newton observed, "I verily believe that the far greater part of the wars in Africa would cease if the Europeans would cease to tempt them by offering goods for slaves. Once captured and sold to Europeans, the Africans were then taken to a ship destined for the Americas." Equiano recalled, "The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time. So vile were these conditions that Africans attempted to fling themselves from the ship, but were prevented by doing so by the crew." Equiano entertained these thoughts himself. "I would have jumped over the side, but I could not. And besides, the crew used to watch us very closely." After a long, deadly journey, in disease-ridden and cramped conditions, the enslaved were sold again at the market. Equiano again described this experience. "We were conducted immediately to the merchant's yard, where we were all pent up together, like so many sheep in a fold, without regard to sex or age. On a signal given, such as the beat of a drum, the buyers rush at once to the yard and make their choice of that parcel they like best."
Once the enslaved had been disembarked, the ships made their journeys back to their home port, sometimes with new goods to sell on return. Beeswax, wood, sugar, rum, cotton, and gold were popular. As for John Newton, he continued to work in the slave trade until illness made it impossible for him to return to sea. His journal suggests this may have been a welcome departure. "Thus I was brought out of a way of life disagreeable to my temper and inconvenient to my profession of my Christian faith." It is important to note that Newton's decision to depart from the slave trade was not a moral decision at this point, but a practical one. His moral repulsion with this practice was yet to come. Newton and Equiano's direct knowledge of the trade from their opposite experiences made their contributions to the abolitionist cause particularly powerful. Perhaps more than many of the prominent abolitionists, they knew firsthand the full extent of its inhumanity.